Welcome to Pop Culture Retro, which was recently voted the 15th best podcast by the residents of the Golden Years Retirement Community in Boca Raton, Florida. Each show, we'll revisit some of your favorite pop culture memories with insider and outsider perspectives. Now, please help me welcome your hosts, Ike Eisenmann and Jonathan Rosen.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of Pop Culture Retro. I'm one of your hosts, Jonathan Rosen, along with Ike Eisenmann. And today we are thrilled to welcome a writer, editor, artist who worked at Marvel for over 20 years. He's responsible for writing and creating the blueprint for the beloved series, The Transformers. He worked on one of my favorite series, Ghost Rider, and oversaw such classic series as Fantastic Four, Daredevil, and Spider-Man. And what's more, he's a fellow New Yorker. Please help us welcome Bob Budiansky. Bob, thanks so much for joining us today.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, to start with, were you a big comic book reader as a kid? And if so, what were some of your favorites?
Oh, I was definitely a big comic book reader as a kid, without a doubt. So from early on, like, when I was 5 or 6 years old, I became aware of them because I had older brothers, so there were comic books in the house. And then once I was able to go out and get my own comics, probably around 1961, which I was around 7 years old, perhaps. I was able to go out, purchase comics on my own. So I was big into the Justice League of America and a lot of DC comics, The Flash, Green Lantern, Superman. That was my early introduction to comics. I still have the first comic book I ever purchased, which is Justice League of America #6. The Wheel of Misfortune. Great comic.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Yes.
Did you come from a family of artists, and at what age did you realize you had a talent for art?
I would say I came from a family who are very diverse in their interests. No artists. I really took a liking to art by the time I was like 5 years old, probably earlier. The phone's ringing. Excuse me. Out of the way. Any case, I just took a liking to it. So I was drawing all the time as a very young boy, and I just kept drawing. And as I got older and got into comics, my mom would take me down to the local Woolworths, and we would buy a pad of typewriter paper. I don't know if people in your audience knows what a typewriter is, but anyway, it'd come in a pad, with a glued edge to it, so that it was like you peel off each sheet at a time. And I would turn those pads into my drawing pads, and I would draw my own stories, my own comic book stories, with the characters that I was reading at the time. And I'd run out of a pad, and we'd go down to Woolworths, and my mom would buy me the next pad. So I drew a lot.
I think our audience knows what a typewriter is. Their kids may not.
Yeah.
So I was reading that in college you wrote a series called Super Runt. What was that about?
It was about college. It was about feeling like like kind of a sad sack, observer of all the stuff going on. We were just trying to have fun. I had a writing partner. We were just trying to have fun with the typical days in and out of being a college student, at least from our perspective. So the student newspaper ran 3 times a week. And so my junior and senior year, I believe. I don't remember, maybe just my senior year. We'd run it every issue. We'd have a strip. The college newspaper was very supportive. The editorial staff was very supportive of our Super Runt.
And I was also the graphic arts
editor at the time.
Can these be found anywhere?
I have copies of them, but no, they're not collected and published anywhere. They're lost into the mists of history. Like the old college paper stuff. A long time ago.
How did you wind up at Marvel, and who was in charge when you first got there?
So, as I just briefly mentioned, I was a graphic arts editor at the newspaper, so at the college newspaper. which meant I would provide illustrations for a lot of stories that, you know, I'd come up with my own crazy ideas and they publish them. So I frequently had, you know, 1, 2, 3 different pieces of artwork in every newspaper issue. And I had other people that worked on it too, to did their own illustrations. But so there was a lot of encouragement for art in the newspaper. Meanwhile, one of my fellow editors, the arts editor, who was the guy who was mainly in charge of like reviewing movies and concerts and stuff like that, we both graduated at the same time, and he went to New York City. I was from New York, but I was in college at the University of Buffalo. He went to New York. He got an entry-level job at Marvel Comics, and as the editorial assistant in the Marvel British department, which is basically a reprint department, reprinting American comics for the British comic book market at that time. And so, and I stayed on as a graduate student. I was actually, I had graduated with a degree in civil engineering, and I went for grad school for transportation engineering. So while I was in grad school, my friend Jay, the guy who got the job, you know, he said, well, when you're down in New York, you know, come on down and, you know, I'll show you the office and, you know, meet people and all that. So I came down during the Christmas holiday season, my first year of grad school. I brought my portfolio of my artwork, and he introduced me to one of the art directors, Marie Severin, who very nicely told me to find another career. And and I say this honestly, she was very nice about it. She probably saw people like me parade through her office, you know, a few times a week, and had to gently move them on to something else, and not, you know, because they weren't ready for prime time there yet. But anyway, a few months later, like in May of 1976, Jay informed me that he was leaving his job because he really didn't want to work in comics. He wanted to work in movie review, film, you know, section of a newspaper, which a job that he eventually got. He said, I'm leaving my job. Do you want to interview for it? You know, by this time I had already been down to the office twice, met some people there. So I got to do a phone interview, a half-hour phone interview with his boss. His boss was Larry Lieber, Stan Lee's brother. And I remember the phone interview was basically like, you know, we talked for about a half hour, and Larry kept saying, gee, it would really be nice to meet you in person, but I need somebody to work here on Monday. So, and Jay and these other guys who've met you, they say nice things about you. So, okay, you have the job. So that was on a Wednesday, and by Monday I was working. I dropped out of grad school. It was the end of the season. It was the end of the semester anyway. So I didn't even pack up. I had to go back the following weekend to pack up. Back to Buffalo, and I started working there on Monday as an editorial assistant for the Marvel British department. That's how I got my start.
Wow. So what were some of your first responsibilities at Marvel?
Well, as the editorial assistant, you know, you're basically in charge of trafficking stuff, you know, getting stuff from artists to writers, or in this case, since most of it was reprint, but not all of it, because we started a comic book called Captain Britain at that time as well, a few months later. But basically, you know, like you're dealing with photostats of film, or proofs, photostats, which were then turned into pages, which became the British comic books. So these were shipped over in some form, and so I was, you know, running around getting photostats made, giving them to our production department to paste them on boards, doing touch-ups, changing the spelling, because British spellings are different than American spellings for a lot of words. And I wasn't doing all these things myself, but I was just running around getting all this stuff from point A to point B so it could get packaged off to England and get printed there. But then one of the other things that was part of my responsibilities was we needed new artwork. Even though we were reprinting a lot of art, a lot of comic book pages, the comic book stories were typically cut in half. The British market had a different schedule than the American market. American market usually a monthly schedule. In the British market, it was a weekly schedule. So typically we'd take 2 comic books, cut each one in half. And so there would be like Spider-Man would be the front one, and maybe Iron Fist would be the back one. You know, there'd be 2 different stories going on. but they would only get half a story. And then the following issue, you do the second half, but you would need a new splash page, a new first page. So we were hiring wannabe artists, up and coming artists, which included people like John Romita Jr. and Frank Miller and Michael Golden during the time I was there, and me. So I would provide either instructions or sketches that other people did, and eventually I did the sketches for a lot of these things. So it would be handed out to a lot of these artists, and then they would kind of simulate the artists that they were supposedly, supposedly doing that new splash page, like a Gene Colan or a Don Heck or Jack Kirby or John Buscema. But obviously it was a bunch of kids who were just trying to get their foot in the door, like myself. In fact, when I took the job, when I interviewed for the job, Jay warned me. He said, "Don't tell Larry you want to be an artist, but if you tell him you want to be an artist, he won't hire you. Because if he hires you and he knows you want to be an artist, you'll just quit on him as soon as you can," which is exactly how it worked out. So I made it clear once I had the job I wanted to be an artist, and Larry was very good about giving me opportunities. So I did a lot of these sketches, and then I did some of the artwork myself. And I was working with our art director, who was terrific to work with, the same Marie Severin who told me to take a hike 6 months earlier. And I'm sure she forgot who I was by that point, but she could not have been a better teacher, more generous with her time, just, like a mentor to me, to make me become a better comic book artist, starting out early in my career. So I can't say enough good things about her. That gives you an idea of how I started and what I did at the British Department.
Huh. Well, what was Jim Shooter like to work for?
Well, okay, initially, I didn't really work directly with Jim Shooter, because I worked with Larry Lieber in the British Department, which was like, the forgotten cousin of the rest of the company. We did our own thing. I don't think Jim Shooter was even editor-in-chief when I first started there, but he became editor-in-chief soon after. So eventually, I went freelance, and then I came back on staff as an assistant editor on a mainstream Marvel comic book office, as opposed to the British Department. And by that point, Jim Shooter was editor-in-chief. I was an assistant editor. I wasn't working directly with him. Eventually, I went freelance again to draw Ghost Rider, and then I came back on staff. Jim invited me back on staff to be a full editor by this point, back in 1983. And so working with Jim was very educational. He was terrific at giving people opportunities. He gave me great opportunities. He also had a very rigid, maybe rigid might be too strong a word, but he had a very specific idea of what goes into a comic book story, which created friction with some people. Not so much with me, but he created, over the years, he became more and more, in conflict with certain creative people and editors as well. And so, but I had a very positive working relationship with him overall. And like I said, he was great at giving people opportunity. If he saw that you had some talent, some budding talent, it's not even there yet, he'd give you a shot at different things. And that's what he did with me on a couple of occasions. So I appreciate him for that.
I think I've read very much a lot of people give the same type of description as you just did about Shooter.
Okay. Yeah. I think people are all over the spectrum on how they related to him. Some people related very positively to him, and some people came butting heads with him. But I think he meant well. But I think the meaning in following his own his own compass of what he thought needed to be done for making comic books, he drove some people away as well.
Well, I remember as a kid, my dad was a teacher, and he was able to, I remember one time he was able to arrange a class trip to Marvel, and me and my friends come along. I was so incredibly excited to be there. Was it a source of excitement for you to be able to work at this company? It was just like a job at that time for you?
Oh, no, it was I just come out of college, and it was like an extension of college. It was fun, like there were a lot of people in my peer group, we got to hang out together. We'd come up with these, it wasn't just us kids coming up with crazy ideas. It was the people who were a generation older than us who were doing the same thing. We were just coming up with stuff and throwing it into the books, and, people were reacting positively to it. So yeah, it was a job, and sometimes it was more of a grind than others, but generally it was a terrific experience. 90% of the time. There were down times too, but overall it was a wonderful place to work, and I worked with a lot of wonderful people.
Well, you mentioned Larry Lieber. So Stan Lee was already out of the day-to-day operations at that time. So, but how much of an influence, or I guess shadow cast, did he still have over the company at that point?
With Stan, well, like you said, he wasn't doing day-to-day stuff, and he was actually, when I first started there, I mean, he was still in New York. He was still in the New York area. And he'd pop into the office, and he had his own office. He was publisher at the time. He had his corner office in the building. But he wasn't involved in the day-to-day operations of the books. So he was doing other stuff. And then eventually he, within a couple of years of me being there, it may have been like less than a year or two, he moved out to Los Angeles to try to sell Marvel for TV and movies and animation and things like that. So he was, I think he was a positive person, positive force to be there. Like, people who worked there and knew him, I didn't know him, really liked him, generally, from my impression. But I don't think he was reading the books day to day before they went out to be printed. He had other things by that point. I mean, by that point, he had other people taking the editor-in-chief job. And as you might know, like in the early 70s, it was a revolving door. Before my time, basically, when Jim Shooter came aboard as editor-in-chief, he stabilized things quite a bit. But prior to him, there was a whole series of editor-in-chiefs that didn't stay very long.
Well, you mentioned Ghostwriter, which was one of the first things you
Give me one
worked
moment.
on regularly. Oh, sure.
I have to get rid of this phone.
I would be more concerned if it wasn't ringing.
That's my work phone, by the way. So
Gotcha.
I'm not responding to my work phone calls.
Okay. Well, as I said, you had mentioned Ghostwriter, which is one of the first things you worked regularly on. Do you remember during what run of the comics that was?
So I have a very strange history with drawing Ghostwriter. So I believe with issue 33, I did my first cover for Ghostwriter, and that cover came about from a very weird set of circumstances. So that cover showed Ghostwriter being attacked by aliens from a large spaceship, which is a very unusual antagonist for Ghostwriter to face, since he was known for being like a supernatural creature dealing with demons and all sorts of weirdo characters. But at the time that came out, which was the late 70s, sci-fi movies were like at the height of their popularity. You just had Star Wars, Close Encounters of the First Kind, and so on. So I had made a reputation prior to that of drawing backgrounds, very detailed backgrounds, very well. So when we were doing Captain Britain, going back to my British days, one of our artists was Ron Wilson, and Ron Wilson's strong points were drawing action, not so much background. So I had travel guidebooks of English scenery, like London and Trafalgar Square and Piccadilly Circus and Big Ben and all that kind of stuff. So I would fill in the backgrounds in great detail to give it a feel of being in England, even though I'd never been there. And so the editor of Ghostwriter remembered that. And he said, "Okay, Bob, I want you to draw this Ghostwriter cover, because the artist who's doing the interior, he felt would draw like a spaceship from the 1950s, like a flying saucer. And the editor wanted something that looked more like you saw in what one would see in Close Encounters of the Third Kind or Star Wars. So I drew this massive, really detailed spaceship in the background, which he loved. The editor loved it. As a result of that, for the next couple of years, I was not every month, but mostly the regular cover artist on Ghostwriter, having never drawn a regular monthly interior for books. I had drawn one or two books, but I wasn't the interior artist for a regular book yet. And then finally, with issue 68, I became the interior artist for Ghostwriter as well. So that's when I took it. So it was a long answer to your question. I took it over as an interior artist from 68 till its end at issue 81, and I skipped a couple issues because of deadline problems. But prior to that, I had drawn about 2/3 of the covers between issues 23, issue 33 and issue 67 before I took it over on 68. So unusual, path to drawing Ghost Rider.
Well, I'm fascinated by this with the covers. Now, how does that work? Do you have the freedom to draw what you want based on the issue, or is it more like a collaborative effort where people say this should be on the cover?
Well, usually the editor of the book is responsible for conceiving what goes on the cover. Now, the editor himself may not be an artist. Sometimes the editor will give you a stick figure, but then he'll hire somebody like me. He'll hire somebody to draw a sketch, or he'll go to one of the art directors to do a sketch. Says, here's my idea, do a sketch. And then once the sketch is to the satisfaction of the editor of the book, it'll go out to an artist to do a final version of it. So, jumping ahead a little bit, when I was working on Transformers, I didn't draw very much on Transformers. I was mostly the writer, but I would do a lot of cover sketches, even though I wasn't the editor, but I was in charge of the project because I was the writer, I guess. So I was kind of given a lot of leeway. So the editors I worked with weren't artists, and they let me come up with cover ideas. So I would do a sketch, show it to the editor, and then once the editor approved it, it would be given to the artist. Sometimes the artist was me, but mostly it wasn't.
Well, when you were first at Marvel, you were more of an artist than a writer. Did you have that itch to write as well, or look at some of the storylines and think, I can do better?
Well, I don't want to. That would be very pompous of me to say I haven't written anything, but I could do better. No, but I did. The more I was there, the more I wanted to do. So yeah, I definitely wanted to be a writer. I wanted to get the opportunity to be a writer. So initially, I was co-plotting Ghost Rider stories with J.M. DeMatteis, and then I co-plotted a couple of Avengers stories, and so one thing built on the next. One thing built on the previous thing, and then eventually I became a writer on Transformers, where I was, more than just plotting stories. I was writing the dialogue and everything. Yeah, but yeah, definitely. As I said earlier, like the great thing about being at Marvel, and especially working when Jim Shooter was there, was there were opportunities, and if you were there at the right moment and you showed the right skills, then the opportunity came along and you grabbed it and you tried to run with it. So I had opportunities that I was able to leverage into actual work, regular work for myself, and I enjoyed it.
Just one more covers things I wanted to find out about. Now, you did the Submariner covers with all the interlocking designs. Was that you came up with that, or that they planned that out?
Yeah, it's just me being silly. Yeah, it's just like I'll make them all fit together. And I'm surprised you know about that, but yeah, like anytime I go to a convention and people bring me Submariner books to autograph, I'll always point that out to them, and they'll be amazed. Really? I'll show them how they all fit together. I never knew that. There's all sorts of little secrets, swirled away in different comic books.
Oh, that's awesome.
Well, when did you first start taking on writing duties at Marvel, and what were some of the storylines that you were responsible for at the beginning?
Well, like I said, I originally my first opportunity was on Ghost Rider when. Actually, I might have even written some Captain Britain stuff when I was still there on Marvel British Department, but I forget. I think I may have gotten a story, plot credit, or maybe even scripting. But on the mainstream books, first it was Ghost Rider. That was in the early '80s with Mark DeMatteis. We would co-plot the stories together, and he would then dialogue the stories. I didn't have anything to do. I had nothing to do with the scripting. But the big jump was Transformers. So in 1983, in November of '83, Jim Shooter, this is like one of those opportunities. He came to me out of desperation and asked me to help him with the development of this new property that Marvel had taken on from Hasbro Toys, which is the Transformers. And Jim Shooter wrote the initial treatment for the Transformers, like a 6-page treatment, which sets up the worldview. You know, they're the good guys and they're the bad guys, and here's why they're fighting, and so on. And initially, he went to a very senior editor with a lot of writing background, and asked that editor to write character profiles and come up with names for the initial 26 Transformer toys. And that didn't work out. So I'm not sure why it didn't work out, but it didn't work out because I was not involved yet. But after it didn't work out, Jim came down editorial row, which is all the editors' offices lined up one after the other, and asked those editors who had writing skills, starting I think with Larry Hama, who had already done the exact same kind of development for G.I. Joe, and he asked them, hey, I got this new book, Transformers. I need somebody to develop these characters, come up with some names, and you have like a handful of days to do it before the Thanksgiving holiday of 1983. And they all turned him down. Like I think 3 or 4 other editors were offered this opportunity and said, nah, I'm busy, I'm not interested. And then he finally had to come to me in sheer desperation, because I was known more as an artist editor. I was on staff at that time as an editor, but I was known more as an artist and not as a writer. So I said, sure, I'm not doing anything this weekend. So I probably got the assignment on Wednesday or Thursday. And by Monday, right before Thanksgiving, I had to turn something in for these 26 characters. And I did. And he liked them. And he showed it to Hasbro. I guess he had a deadline from Hasbro. He sent it onward he forwarded all that material to Hasbro. They liked it too. And so I became the Transformers guy. And so out of those 26 initial Transformers, I named 24 of them. I wrote the profiles for all of them. And then when Marvel put out the Transformers miniseries in 1984, I was then assigned to be the editor of the 4-issue miniseries, not the writer, the editor. But as the editor, I was pretty much calling all the shots. I understood the property very well. The writers that I had actually was a revolving door. For a 4-issue miniseries, I had 3 writers, which is not the way you want to plan a miniseries. But nobody really got a handle of it. You know, they tried, but I was basically working with them far beyond what an editor needs to do, which is I was kind of almost dictating the plots to them. I think I was in many cases. So Transformers became a big hit, and with issue 4, it was supposed to end with issue 4, a miniseries, but because it was selling so well, the decision was made that it would continue with issue 5 to become a regular comic book. And as a regular comic book, I was special projects editor by this point. As a regular comic book, I could no longer edit the book. It was given to a different editor. I was only there for special projects like miniseries and movie adaptations and things like that. So as special projects editor, I was no longer the editor of the book when it became a regular book, but the new editor said to me, okay, Bob, if you were taking over this book with issue 5, what would you do? And I said, well, I would fire the writer and hire me, since I was doing all the work anyway. And that's what he did. So not to say that, you know, I'm still friends with the guy who was quote unquote fired, you know. So it was I like to say it was a mercy killing. He was, you know, he, like all the other writers that worked on that miniseries, were completely confounded by the property. So I took it over with issue 5. So in answer to your question, that's how I became a writer.
Well, I'm curious.
Sabotaged my predecessor and took it off.
Well, Marvel, by the time Transformers came out, Marvel had already done adaptations. You know, you mentioned G.I. Joe. They had Micronauts and a comic I really loved, Rom. But so why did writers like want to avoid these adaptations, and what was it so bad about them that they didn't want to know part of them?
Well, I can't really speak for other people. You know, it's not you know, it's not like I had an exit interview with each one of them when they turned down the job. You know, I wasn't even the one who asked them. But I mean, just for an example, Larry Hama, he was a full editor and he was writing a monthly book, G.I. Joe. So I don't know if he, you know, had the time in his schedule to add another toy book to, you know, to his writing chores, you know. So and a lot of editors were like that, you know. Like if I said there's an editor who's a writing editor, that meant they had a full-time job and they were probably writing a book a month or more than a book a month in addition to that, freelance. And so I I wasn't in that position yet. You know, I was doing odds and ends freelance, but I wasn't doing a regular monthly book, and I had a full-time 9 to 5 editorial job. So so when this opportunity came up to write it, I thought, well, I could fit this in. And so of the next, from issue 5 through 55, I wrote, I think, all but maybe 2 or 3 issues. So I wrote almost 50 issues.
Wow.
Geez, I mean, well, it sounds like Hasbro gave you a lot of freedom creating all the backstories. Did they give you any input into changes or things they wanted differently?
I would say overall, Hasbro loved what I gave them. The only thing they said is, give us more. Here's another 25 toys coming out later this year.
Oh my God.
So I eventually named 250 toys approximately.
Oh my God.
Wrote profiles for about 250 toys that showed up on the back of the packaging. So yeah, Hasbro had to review everything. They had to approve everything. All the names had to go through, like different people approving it, including their lawyers. They had to do trademark searches and such things for different names. But they were very happy with what I did overall. And so, so from 1983, November 83, through like the first half of 1989, I was their guy at Marvel to develop all of these new toys that were coming down the pike every year. It was, as Transformers was such a successful toy property, Hasbro just kept spinning out more and more toys, and they would send me, first they sent me the actual toys, but they were all rebranded Japanese toys initially. So they would give me the toys, say, here's the toy, come up with a name, come up with a profile for this character, okay? So I did that. And then eventually they ran out of toys that they could rebrand, so they would have new toys designed, and they would send me model sheets. And the model sheets would just be diagrammed artwork of what the toy looks like in the different transformers. It transforms from this mode to that mode to that mode. So like, you have a humanoid robotic mode, and it transforms into a car or a truck or a lobster or whatever it is. And I would come up with whatever I had to come up with to name that character and write a profile about it.
So Shooter came up with the original concept of what I guess the world, and then you expanded it from there.
Yes, exactly it. That's exactly it. So once he did the initial treatment, he was done with it. He walked off it. He was very, I'm sure if you'd asked him if he remembers, he'd be very thankful of the fact that I was able to give this off to Bob and go on with my life without having to deal with Transformers. Because that's what happened. Like once I took it over, I don't think he got pulled into too many meetings with Hasbro anymore. He had other things to do. So it was my property to head up, at least from the Marvel side of things.
So what inspired some of the names, and were there any that you really liked that didn't make the cut?
I mean, everything inspired names, like TV, movies, books. I still do crossword puzzles. I did crossword puzzles back then, so I had a pretty good facility with vocabulary, and so I was able to pull words together. Also, I had an engineering background, so at one point I met up with some Hasbro executives for a meeting, and one of them said to me, "Were you ever in the military?" I said, "No." He said, "Well, because you have all of this technical jargon in your in your profiles." And I said, "Well, that's because I have an engineering background, so I was able to pull some of that verbiage into that." So like, okay, so I named one character Ironhide. He's an ambulance. No, he wasn't an ambulance. He was I forget what he was, but anyway, I named him Ironhide. Well, in the 1960s, NBC had a TV show called Ironsides, which was about a detective who was restricted to a wheelchair, played by Raymond Burr. So that came from there. I had an ambulance character named Ratchet, and Ratchet came from 2 sources. One is a ratchet is actually a tool that mechanics use to help fix things, and Nurse Ratchet from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And so I had a character who was an ambulance, who was basically a doctor, turned into an ambulance. So I figured, oh, that's a good combination of ideas, like a tool that fixes things, as well as Nurse Ratchet, even though she was kind of evil. and the Autobots. Was good. So I came up with all sorts of names, but my favorite name was Megatron, and Megatron they turned down initially. Hasbro heard Megatron, and I thought like mega at that time. Now it has a different connotation, but at that time, megaton meant nuclear war bombs. You know, like you the way that scientists measured the destructive power of a bomb was in megatons or kilotons. So I took mega and I took tron, which is a suffix for for technical things. And I just pushed them together. I thought it had such a great sound to it for the main bad guy, and I gave it to Hasbro, and that was my initial batch of names, and they turned it down. And I said, well, how come? Because I knew this was their property; they could do whatever they want. But I said, well, okay, I understand, but you can do what you want. But I really like Megatron. I was just curious, like, why did you turn it down? Oh, well, we think it sounds too scary. So I had to, I felt like maybe I was going out of my envelope a little bit too much, but being a little presumptive to say anything to them. But I said, listen, he's the main bad guy. I think he's supposed to sound scary. And they really hadn't looked at it that way before. So I kind of, enlightened them, and they said, okay, we'll go with Megatron. And that's my favorite name that I came up with.
Oh, wow. That's awesome. Well, at what point did you realize the series was a huge hit?
Well, we would get sales figures at Marvel. So, it was a hit. Now, there's a lot of reasons why it was a hit. Maybe it was the concept, but it was also like, it was released around the same time as the animation on TV, the animated Saturday morning TV show. And there was all sorts of promotion on commercials, advertising Transformers. So it was like a multimedia, I don't know, multimedia explosion of Transformers coming from comics and TV and ads and toys. And so there was all sorts of support for the comic book. And, I think we also wrote good stories, but I don't want to take all the credit. There was a lot of other stuff going on pushing Transformers. But we became a hit. So Marvel tries all these miniseries with the expectation that if their sales are good, we'll continue it. If the sales aren't good, it'll end with the miniseries. And at that time, Marvel was working with all sorts of outside partners, movie companies, toy companies, etc., trying different things. So like nowadays, I don't think they bother with licensed properties from other companies, but back then they did a lot of that, like you mentioned, ROM and Micronauts and so on. So
I think I probably read all of them wherever it came out then. But now you mentioned the British series as well, the comics. So all the British ones, even on Transformers, were like reprints at that time?
Well, actually, okay, so mostly they were reprints, but when I was starting the British department in '76, by later that year, we launched Captain Britain, which was an original comic book just for the English market. We didn't print it in the States. Years went by, and by the time Transformers rolled around, Marvel UK had its own office where they packaged together their own comics. The Marvel British department in the New York City office had by that point come to an end. So I think Marvel just shipped film out there. But because of the schedule of the weekly comic books, Marvel UK would burn through reprints of our books a lot quicker than we could put them out. So with the Transformers, they brought in different writers to do fill-in issues in between my issues. They would reprint my issues, and then there might be a gap for a couple of weeks, and they would find a way to insert a story in there that did not disrupt my continuity. And the writer they brought in to do that was eventually was Simon Furman, and he became like the regular fill-in writer for the fill-in issues they had to do.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. Now, if they were doing some originals, did they have to clear that with you, the story, because you were in charge of the main line?
No, I mean, they probably should have cleared it with the editor, not me. I was just the writer. But they probably should have cleared it with the editor. But really, Marvel UK, I don't mean to like demean them, but like they were kind of beneath our notice. Like they did whatever they did. It didn't affect anything we did in the States.
Oh.
So we, meaning the Marvel editorial office for the Transformers, would provide the Marvel UK department, the Marvel UK office, with whatever materials that they needed. Like they would get probably advanced copies of whatever stories I was writing and drawing before they were printed. They would get photocopies of them or something. They would get reference materials, like I mentioned, those model sheets. They would get copies of the model sheets, etc. And actually, I was speaking to Simon Furman recently. We just did a convention together a few weeks ago, and he was saying it took them months, if not years, to get on the same wavelengths as the Marvel offices in the States. They really weren't getting the materials. They weren't getting the model sheets and so on. When they gave out their books, when they gave out stories to their artists to draw, they were dependent. They may have seen like 1 or 2 frames of this character in the previous month's comic book, and that's all they had as reference material to continue drawing that character. Eventually, they got more in line with what they needed. But but again, I wasn't involved in any of that communication. All I knew was there was a Marvel office in England. They were doing some fill-in issues. Didn't affect what I was doing.
Well, when you did crossovers with other characters, like for example, there was a Transformers Spider-Man issue. You said that Hasbro didn't like it.
That's true. I'm sorry, I'm being interrupted by a dog. Okay.
Oh, hey,
Okay.
that's
This
our
is a
favorite
dog
kind
break.
of interruption.
Sorry, explaining to your audience, dog break.
We've had this happen a lot.
This is what happens when you sit next to the back door to the backyard. So, yeah, what happened with Spider-Man? So one of the writer that I eventually got fired off of Transformers when I took it over was Jim Salicrup, who was also the Spider-Man editor. He was also my former boss when I was his assistant editor. So anyway, Jim Salicrup thought it would be a great idea to feature Marvel's premier character, Spider-Man, as a guest star in Transformers. I thought it was a great idea too, and being that he was the Spider-Man editor, he had the authority to allow Spider-Man to be guest starring in another book. So we presented that to Hasbro, and they turned it down. And we couldn't figure out, like, why are you turning down Spider-Man? It's like a gift we're giving you guys, for your toy that nobody knows what it is. So it turned out the reason, you always have to think from, what is it from their point of view? They're a toy company. At the time, Marvel had a deal with another toy company to produce action figures of Marvel characters, including Spider-Man. So they looked at it as, well, if we feature Spider-Man in a Transformers comic book, all we're doing is helping to promote this other toy company's action figures. Which to me is like such a bizarre way of looking at things. Like, you're not doing competing action figures. What do you care if they sell a few action figures? But that's how they looked at it. Well, at the time, Spider-Man had just been introduced in his black and white costume. So Jim Salicrup suggested, why don't we offer Hasbro Spider-Man in his black and white costume, because that is not licensed as an action figure to the other toy company. So that's what we did. We featured him as a guest star in his black and white costume, and Hasbro was okay with that.
Well, how about other writers of Marvel in the same vein here? Like, was there ever any worry or annoyance by people that work on other comics because now they may interrupt plot lines that they're setting up if you have to, like, now do a crossover with Transformers? Is it canon, or was it just, just enjoy the issue and don't worry about anything else?
We were very naive back then. So nobody cared that Spider-Man was in Transformers, and there were other toy books that featured Marvel crossovers too. I don't think it was just us. I think Micronauts. It's like I was the editor of a Micronauts X-Men miniseries.
I remember that.
Yeah. So like, it wasn't that unusual, but decades passed, and who knew that one day Transformers would still be an ongoing property, almost 40 years later. All these other companies have the license over the years, and they want to reprint all the Marvel's materials, and they can't reprint those issues with Spider-Man in it or anything else that's Marvel copyrighted. So or Marvel trademark. So that we didn't know we were creating these problems decades into the future by featuring Marvel guest stars in the Transformers. We just thought, like, okay, we print this issue, we sell a few extra copies, and forget about it. Nobody will ever think about it again. But those issues have been reprinted constantly over the years. Sure. At least ones without Spider-Man.
So when the cartoons came out, did you have any involvement at all? Like, did they have to run any of the stories by you, so you didn't do anything against what was? No? Yeah. Okay.
The only involvement I had was very indirect. So I would provide Hasbro with all of these character profiles and names, like I mentioned earlier, and Hasbro would approve them, and then they would pass those on to the to Sunbow Productions, the company doing the animation. And then what they did with them, I don't know, but they used the same names as that I came up with, and I guess they used some of the personality quirks that I threw in there, and maybe some of the abilities and the weaponry and so on that I described. But I don't know. I never watched the animation, so I'm involved with that.
Now, you mentioned that about getting new toys into the comics. Was there a lot of pressure on you that said, "Hey, you got to get this into a comic book. We're releasing this soon"?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. The simple answer is yes. So at any time that Hasbro had a new line of toys to roll out into their into the public, they wanted those toys to appear in the comic book. So I wouldn't say like there was a lot of pressure, like they were calling me every day, but I knew my job. And my job was to find a way to introduce yet another 10, 20 characters into the storyline, which meant if I had been developing a storyline featuring this set of characters, I really had to put it aside or find a way to come to an end and make room for all these other characters. And so, frankly, over the years, it became more and more of a burden on me as a writer to figure out new ways to get all these new characters into the book. And so I was kind of burned out on it. I was trying to get off the Transformers book for probably up to a year before I finally got off the book. My editor kept begging me to stay on the book because he didn't know who else could write it.
Now, when you killed off Optimus Prime, was it difficult to get acceptance for that?
No, they were okay with it.
Yeah.
And also, I think I probably mentioned to them. Sorry, I have to check on the dog. I think I also mentioned to them that I'd bring him back, which is what I did. But again, I don't remember the specifics of the like the details of the timing of it, but it might have been like, oh, we're going to be introducing all these new characters anyway, and we don't need Optimus Prime to be centerpiece every issue. We can push him off to the side.
I do want to ask one question about, you mentioned special projects that you did, like movie adaptations. For example, I know that you like the Indiana Jones one and The Last Crusade. So do you get to see those films earlier, or tell the story that you'd be able to release it to, or told the story that you have to release it to coincide with the movie release?
Okay, so a couple of questions there. So we would get a script, obviously. We would get a lot of stills from the movie. Usually the movie wasn't in any shape to be seen at the time we were drawing the comic books. Like we're doing this 5 or 6 months ahead of printing. So, the movie's not in any kind of form where they could show it to us. Sometimes we were able to see some raw footage of a movie, but it varied depending on the movie. Like the first movie adaptation I did was a movie called Rock and Rule. I don't know if you know that.
I do not have. Yes.
But that's an animated movie, and it featured Lou Reed and Debbie Harry and their voices, and it was a weird amalgamation of animal characters that were made to be anthropomorphic and a rock sensibility. It's like Saturday Morning meets CBGBs or something. It was very strange. But in any case, and maybe some of the music was pretty good actually. But in any case, they had rough footage of that, so I was given a tape cartridge which I could look at figure out how to paste the comic book and all that. But it really varied. So we would get, but I would on a few occasions go out to visit some movie studio on the West Coast, and you know, go through piles and piles of stills from the movie and pick them out for my artists or whatever.
Well, do you have any leeway in adaptations, or is it strictly a scene by scene
well, you gotta
representation of the movie?
You gotta make choices, you know, like you're limited by the number of pages that the comic book's going to have. So you have to find, you're definitely telling a story in an abbreviated format compared to the movie. So you got to make choices. Yeah, there's somebody at the movie studio who's looking it over, and some, you know, again, every book is different. So sometimes, like I think with Dune, when we adapted Dune, we kept getting feedback from whoever was reviewing what we were sending. This is wrong, you know, this, and we say this is directly from the script you guys sent us. We're just copying the script, but you know, they had made changes in the movie, and then we're not aware of it. So they keep telling us how we were going off course and making, you know, showing the wrong things or having the characters say the wrong words. And it's exactly what you guys sent us. We're just following what you sent us. So, you know, we're at their mercy. But every movie studio, every movie is a different situation. You know, and there were lots of movie studios, all they cared about in their approval process was to make sure that the actors looked correct, you know. Or if you're going to draw David Bowie, he has a good side and a bad side. This is for Labyrinth. Don't show him on his bad side, draw him from his good side. You know, things like that. You learn all these little quirks. So you just had to be conscious of what, you know, what they were, what was in their interest, what they were most concerned about. Yeah.
Well, you talk about the Transformers. At one point, the Transformers started to wane. The comic book, the popularity, I guess, started to wane. So many years later, Michael Bay wants to develop it into a film series. So do you remember your thoughts at the time? Were you surprised that it was making this big comeback?
Well, I knew it was making a comeback before that, but I was shocked when I heard they were making a live action movie out of it. You know, but it seemed so far removed from, you know, from its origins, which was a comic book, a toy, and an animated TV show, that, you know, they're putting out that I think Steven Spielberg was an executive producer on the movie. So, you know, these are like big names in Hollywood. They're putting tons of money into making this property a live action limited to, like, a lot of it's CGI, obviously. But so I was shocked. But you know, now it's like everything's like that. Every toy's becoming a live action movie, or, you know, there's really no clear line between animation and live performance anymore in most big blockbuster movies. So Transformers might have been you know, one of the forerunners of kind of setting that tradition to where we are today, you know.
Well, were you asked to have any involvement at all, like even a film cameo?
Sadly, no.
Oh,
I've never been tapped on the shoulder by anybody from Hollywood saying, "Hey, Bob, you had a lot to do with this back in the day. Why don't you come on as a consultant? Or why don't we give you a thank you in the credits like they do in the Marvel?" Yeah, I'm still waiting for that.
Oh, wow. Incredible.
Yeah.
So
that's
your thoughts
showbiz,
on
you say. So
your thoughts on the series?
on the movie series?
Yeah.
I liked the first one, and then I thought it went downhill rapidly after that. I haven't watched all of them. I thought it went downhill rapidly. It wasn't my style of what I enjoy in movie theaters. Well, I think they call it destruction porn or something like that. You know, just like a bunch of large robots smashing things together, and a bunch of humans sitting on the sidelines being ineffective, basically. And you know, it really wasn't for me. I know with Bumblebee, they made somewhat of a comeback. They humanized the story a lot more. So I thought, you know, it wasn't a great movie, but it was an okay movie, I thought. So that's my thoughts. But I didn't see the most recent one.
Oh, it sounds like they need your involvement.
Well, maybe.
So looking back at your time in the Transformers at the comic, what comes to mind the most?
About my time in the Transformers? What comes to mind the most? I think what was special about working on the Transformers was I had so much freedom to do what I wanted to do. Unlike a regular Marvel book with Marvel characters, which has all these constraints of continuity, like Spider-Man has this past of all these characters and all these interactions with people. So even though a new writer can come on a book like Spider-Man and bring in some new ideas, you're still trapped by the history of Spider-Man to some extent. And like you can say that about X-Men, Iron Man, Avengers, whatever. But Transformers was pretty much a blank slate. I had the initial premise that Jim Shooter wrote up, and after that, I was able to expand the universe and the Transformers universe in almost any direction I wanted to. So I had a lot of freedom to do what I wanted. So that was enjoyable, and not to feel that kind of constraint. Now, of course, I had my limitations. It's a comic book for kids. I wasn't trying to do anything that was R-rated or X-rated or anything like that. I was trying to keep it within certain bounds, but I knew that I wasn't like stupid. I knew what I was doing, and but that was it. It was very enjoyable for the first few years, and then it became a burden because I kept having to find new ways to add all these new characters into the book, and I needed to move on. So,
well, do you have a particular favorite Transformer?
Favorite Transformer?
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
The stories I wrote, some of the better stories involved a character called Blaster. So Blaster was just like, he just fit in those stories really well, and those stories came out to my opinionated judgment, my biased judgment, came out. Those stories came out pretty good. So I was happy writing stories for Blaster, but for the short duration of stories I did for him. Yeah.
Well, do you ever take a peek at the current issues of Transformers at all, or the other ones that you're involved with?
No, I don't keep up on things. I get pulled into Transformers conventions. I just did one at the end of August, and I'm going to do another one in October. And people ask me questions all the time about what I think of this current Transformers movie or storyline or whatever. I said, it was just a job. And I moved on. But I always make sure that you understand it was a job I really love doing, and I try to do my best. But then I moved on. I didn't, I'm not a fan. I'm not a Transformers fan. There's a difference between a Transformers fan and a Transformers creative professional who worked on the book. So
yeah,
you could be both, but you don't have to be both. You could be
you
could be just somebody given an assignment and doing your job.
Well, what are you currently working on now?
Nowadays, I'm a recreation director for my town. So I'm currently working on the 5K race in October, which is a big task. So, but other than that, I do comic book conventions. I do occasional art commissions. I just finished a commission a couple of nights ago for a convention I'm doing this Sunday. So the guy running the convention is going to make limited edition prints for his guests at the convention. So I just did that for him. And
what are the next few conventions that you're going to be at? What's the next couple?
The next one is I don't know all the names, but one's in Wayne. The next one's on the 24th. It's in Wayne, New Jersey, and that's a general comic book convention. And then October, I think the weekend of the 21st, 22nd, doing a Transformers convention in Orlando. Doing one, I think December 2nd or something in Lehigh, Pennsylvania. One-day convention, again, a general convention. I have a couple others pending. So I've done about 6 or 7 conventions already this year.
I hope you get to one in South Florida.
well, I'm going to one in Orlando. That's as close as I'm going for now.
Well, how can people follow you on social media?
Well, I don't have a page or anything, but if you go to Facebook and type in my name, you'll find me. There aren't too many Bob Budianskys out there. And I actually get a lot of commission work over the years just from being on Facebook. You know, I don't promote myself, but people who know me, they find me and they get on my commission list.
That's good. Well, Bob, we want to thank you so much for coming on today. It was such a pleasure. I read so much of your work growing up, so it was so much fun to get to talk to you.
Well, I've had a good time talking to both of you as well. So my pleasure too.
Well, this has been Pop Culture Retro. I'm Jonathan Rosen, along with Ike Eisenmann. And again, a very special thanks to Bob Budiansky. And please subscribe.
Thank you for listening to Pop Culture Retro, where no one was hurt during the making of this podcast.